Drazel woke with a slow start, his head still throbbing from where he had been bashed by the butt of a plasma rifle only hours ago, while he struggled to blink away the stars which insisted on clouding his view. Looking around, he spotted fellow members of his crew in similar states of damage and duress in this cramped cell. The seconds tick by as he slowly blinks some more, the fugue caused by his headache finally fading and allowing him to become more aware of his surroundings as he recalled the events that led up to his current predicament. It was just a routine delivery run, transporting minerals from some mining system over to an industrial system for refinement into something or another. Easy work and often low risk. Drazel wasn't even anyone particularly important on this crew. Well, he was important in a sense as head of the custodial division, but it's not like he did much to put his life on the line or took any real risks. As far as he knew, the ship he served on was crossing through a remote and quiet system while they were navigating to the nearest jump point to the next system in their route. He recalled how he was on a call with his elder sister, just talking about nothing in particular, as they gave each other updates on their daily lives when the klaxon alarms suddenly wailed, signaling that they were under attack. In the next moment, impacts crashed against the ship, and they had lost their communications array before soon losing the engines, leaving them dead in the void. It wasn't much longer until the maglocks of a pirate ship latched onto his vessel, and then they were on the move again, while Drazel was forced to wait and see what these void raiders had planned for him and his fellow crewmates. It has been a couple of weeks since then, and the damn pirates had sabotaged the ship's life support before coming through and grabbing everyone while they were barely alive before locking them up in the brig of their damned vessel. Since then, he's had to watch his fellow crewmates fight for the entertainment of the damnable void scum, often with food being used as the reward for their efforts. If one member won the fight, then half of the crew got food, and if the other one won, then the other half of the crew would get to eat. The fights were never pretty, and the loser wasn't allowed to surrender until they were beaten within an inch of their lives. That's not even considering those who refused to fight at the start of it all. Those who dared to defy the pirates and take a stand ended up getting beaten to death anyway, and nobody got to eat that day. It was all just senseless cruelty for the sake of being cruel. Suddenly, the sound of faulty pneumatics caught his ear as the screech of metal on metal cried out with the opening of the brig doors. Damnable junk heap! I can't wait for the captain to finally replace this scrapper, one of the pirates muttered irritably, kicking at the side of the doorway with a reinforced boot as a small group of the bastards walked in, carrying sacks of what appeared to be the emergency rations from his cruise ship, along with a couple of gallons of water. They were a small menagerie of various beings from different races, though Drazel wasn't nearly worldly enough to name them on sight. Not that he cared to. Void Scum was a good enough name for them to him. Alrighty, you lot. You know the deal. One of the pirates called out with a sneer on their kitten-plated face. 2 fighters today, whoever wins, their half of the brig gets to eat today. They mused as the group started to form a wide half-circle around the brig. 4 of the pirates broke off from the rest of the pack, 2 of them using their Omni bracelets to unlock the cells, while the other 2 waded in amongst the prisoners. One of them grabbed Tiluz, an officer from the ship's security force, while the other pirate turned their gaze on Drazel himself. As they were dragged from their cells at gunpoint, the ringleader of this whole twisted affair sneered as he looked between Drazel and Tiluz. 2 fine-looking specimens. Make this a good fight, and don't dream of holding back, he commanded, before procuring a stun baton and tossing it into the middle of the room. Before Drazel could even think of going for the stun baton, Tiluz used his prehensile clawed feet to scoop up the stun baton and toss it into his own hands. With a grimace on his scaled face, he regarded Drazel while activating the stun baton. I'm sorry, but I have no other choice. Drazel just sighed as he put up his claws to try and defend himself. I know. Just don't hold back, Drazel pleaded as he lunged forward, slashing out at the security officer, who deftly dodged and swiped away Drazel's attempts to attack. As the fight got into full swing, the pirates began to cheer and jeer, quickly placing bets as they started to have their fun. Tiluz slammed their elbow into Drazel's chest, displaying their martial prowess as they quickly overwhelmed the custodian, soon bringing the stun baton down into Drazel's shoulder, forcing him to tense and convulse as a closed fist then met his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. As Drazel fell to the ground, Tiluz was quick to follow after, mounting his limp body before bringing the baton down on Drazel over and over again after deactivating it. With each passing blow, Drazel felt his consciousness start to slip, though he did his best to hold out so he didn't go down too quickly, bringing his arms up to at least defend his face while fending off the better-trained security officer. Suddenly, there was a heavy gong sound that resounded through the ship's hull as something seemingly impacted the vessel they were in. The sound was distinct enough to cause the pirates to go quiet and for Tylus to stop fighting, though Drail could hardly be bothered, breathing deeply and heavily as he took the precious few seconds of inactivity to try and collect himself. As the pirates murmured, the ringleader for this whole ordeal spoke up, pointing out a trio from the half-circle that filled the brig. "I don't like the sound of that. Go check it out," he commanded, though the pirates in question just grumbled before reluctantly making their way out of the brig and down the hall. The ringleader then focused back on the fight, sneering as he jutted out a clawed finger at Tylus. "Who said you could stop? Get back to it! We were just getting to the good part!" He mused cruelly as the other pirates cheered. Tylus hesitated, though, the desperate battle fugue already fading as he met Drail's disorientated gaze while panting heavily. The ringleader just sighed, drawing a laser pistol before casually leveling it at Tylus's head. "Come on now. You were performing wonderfully only moments ago," he mused with an almost playful smile on his face. Drail watched as Tylus slowly raised the baton again before slowly exhaling and closing his eyes. That was when screams and laser fire sounded out down the hall the other pirates had gone, soon followed by heavy thuds and crunching when everything went silent again. Steps were soon heard approaching as the sound of something heavy made its way to the doorway. As Drail opened his eyes, he saw a person in an armored, full-body environmental suit with a tinted faceplate. Their heads slowly swiveled as he looked among the crowd of pirates and prisoners before a modulated, masculine voice sounded out. "Is there a Drail here?" he asked simply. The pirates weren't sure what to make of the armored intruder, backing away from the doorway as they started arming and charging their weapons while watching his every move. It took him a couple of moments, but Drail was soon able to muster a response as he shakily raised a hand from where he lay on the ground. I'm Drail," he croaked out painfully before coughing as he took a deep, shuddering breath. The armored figure just nodded his head before planting an armored boot into Zul's chest, sending the security officer sprawling across the brig's floors. "Great. I'm here to pick up a package from you for one Lazuli Forense Rose. Could you please sign here?" the man asked as he took a knee and held out his arm, a holographic panel emitting from it as what looked like a delivery invoice floated in front of Drail's face. Drail couldn't help but just blink in the face of everything that just happened, staring up at the reflective, tinted faceplate of this person before him and then looking at the invoice as it hovered in front of him. "For my sister? A package? What package?" he asked between shaky gasps before wincing as he started to really feel the pain that riddled his face and chest. You," the man replied, having taken a second to review the invoice before holding it back out to him. It was then the ringleader seemingly mustered up their spine, physically non-existent though it may be, as they stepped closer and pressed their laser pistol against the armored man's head. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're not Goy Hick!" The ringleader suddenly cried out before convulsing on the ground as a shoulder-mounted turret sprung up from the man's shoulder, firing off some kind of electrically charged ball of gel. In the next moment, some kind of projection emitted from the helmet of the man as a small, green woman in some strange garb with a crown of thorny roses appeared and stood on the shoulder turret. "Don't you dare touch my Rosie, you bug-eyed creep!" she admonished with a wagging finger as the turret began aiming at the other pirates, but not firing. The armored man just sighed as he stood, pulling away from Drail before glancing at the holographic woman standing on his shoulder. "Now look what you did, Percy. So much for a peaceful extraction," he said while shaking his head. The holographic woman, Percy, just harumphed as she sat down on the turret while crossing her arms. "Peaceful my foot! You already pummeled those guys in the hall." "Yeah, well, what was I supposed to do? They had guns trained on me already," the man asked, seemingly ignoring the room around him as he carried on having his own private conversation. The pirates weren't too sure what to do now, glancing between the ringleader of the fights and the armored man. Some of them began creeping towards the door while others started aiming their rifles and pistols at the man. Before they could get too brave, a second shoulder turret sprouted from his armor, and the two turrets aimed at the pirates as they began slowly swiveling back and forth. "Listen, you lot, I'm only here for this one on the ground. If you don't want to end up like that guy over there or your buddies down the hall, then you're better off leaving and pretending you never saw me," the armored man said as he turned to face the remaining pirates, his tinted faceplate reflecting their own uncertain expressions back at them. After a silent standoff, which was punctuated by the whirring of the shoulder turrets, the pirates quickly fled down the hall. As the footsteps receded to the distance, the shoulder turrets receded as the holographic woman sat on the man's shoulders. The man in question looked back to Drail with his expressionless faceplate before holding out his arm again as the invoice projected from it all over again. Go on, sign it! Drail wheezed out a strained breath before slowly inhaling again. But what about my crew? The man just sighed as he used his free arm to rub the back of his head. Of course. How did I know you were going to ask about them? He said, before looking up at the other cells that filled the brig. There's no way. I don't have the space for them all on my ship. With that, Drail started pushing himself upright despite the protest of his very bruised limbs. Though as T-Luz moved to help him, one of the man's shoulder turrets suddenly aimed again, a menacing red laser lining up on the officer's chest. If that's the case, then I'm not leaving, he said resolutely before grunting some more as he stared down his own reflection in the man's faceplate. The man shook his head slowly as he stood while crossing his arms, the holographic invoice disappearing all over again. The Guardian Angel package your sister paid for does not cover the liberation of your crew. My orders are to get you out of here and safely home, he explained with an authoritative finger wag. At the mention of a price and packages, Drail looked up at the man again, with a determined look in his eyes. I have around 50,000 credits saved up from these last few cycles. I was planning on a nice trip during my next leave, but would that be enough for you to upgrade this package of yours? But it didn't stop there as the rest of the crew started calling out their savings and offers as well, their voices desperate and frantic as the man just looked around at the room and groaned with frustration. Damn it all, Percy! Does this pirate crew have a bounty? He asked, looking to the hollow woman who sat on his shoulder turret even now. Percy looked up at the man and flashed a rather pleased, if not smug little smile. Why yes, Rosie, they do. Quite a substantial one at that. The man let out a low groan again as his shoulders sagged. Fine, fine. I get it, he said, looking at the crew before approaching the various cells as he started breaking locks. I'll just take this crew's bounty to upgrade this commission, the man said before walking over to Drail and holding his hand out to him. Drail couldn't help but smile despite how much it hurt his face as he took the armored man's hand, slowly getting to his feet as his fellow crewmates worked on gathering themselves. I can't thank you enough. What do I call you? Rosie? He asked curiously as he stared at his own image in the taller man's faceplate. The man just scoffed as he shook his head. Only Percy calls me that. He mused almost cheerfully. My ID is Rose 13, but you can just refer to me as R13, he said as he pulled away before starting for the door. Percy, how are my systems looking? He asked as he glanced at the hollow woman on his shoulder. Percy just smiled as she held a thumbs up while standing on the shoulder turret. You are combat ready, Rosie. R13 just nodded as he crossed the threshold of the brig and started down the hall. Understood. It's been 4 days since Drail's ship had been attacked, and 4 days since Lazuli had last seen the face of her little brother before contact had been lost with his vessel. 2 days after that dreaded moment, she had received word that his crew never made it to the delivery point, and the crew was marked as lost to the void by the shipping company that managed her brother's ship. But Lazuli couldn't accept that. Her little brother was the last family she had left, and she wasn't about to just accept that he was lost to the void so easily. In the days following the official statement of the shipping company, she used what few resources that were available to her as a secretary of an influential political figure of the void station. She called home to look into the public records involving the last known position of her brother's ship as well as potential threats in the area. Through her research, she eventually managed to uncover the fact that a roaming fleet of void raiders had been sighted frequenting the star systems her brother had been operating out of. Finally, after 10 days of not having a single clue as to what happened to him, she finally had a direction. From that point, she had used up some of the many days of vacation she had piled up over the years and took a couple of weeks of leave. Now, freed from her responsibilities at work, she began traveling from station to station, following extranet notice boards and advertisements for all sorts of mercenary companies or paramilitary groups of all sorts of races. But after 5 days of being turned away by groups not willing to engage in void combat with raiders on their home turf, her options were starting to become very limited, and the hope of seeing her brother alive again was starting to dwindle. Lazuli finds herself on the 5th void colony station she's traveled to in just as many days. Having been turned away by yet another mercenary band who weren't willing to put their lives on the line for the possibility of finding a single person alive in the middle of unclaimed and raider-infested space. She couldn't blame them, but at the same time, she couldn't help but curse them for being spineless cowards, for not even considering the job despite just how many credits she was ready to put down to see her little brother home safely. Walking down the streets of a void colony that orbited between a gas giant and one of its moons, she ended up stopping at a cafe of some kind and ordering a caffeine stim just to keep her going. Today's poison of choice was some kind of stimulant known as matcha. It was a tea from the human territories that apparently also had a number of health benefits. It tasted good, and at least proved to be an effective stim, as she settled down in a corner of the cafe and started scrolling through the extranet on her Omni bracelet for any more mercenary or military groups she could possibly meet with. After an hour of pointless scrolling through notice boards and information packets about various possible groups that she could reach out to in neighboring star systems, all of a sudden, Lazuli was pulled from the fugue of scrolling when her Omni bracelet trilled with a notification. Before she could wonder for too long about who it could be, she went ahead and clicked the notification when a video began to autoplay. What played out before her was a rather well-made advert for a group of combat couriers. The video in question was very reminiscent of some kinds of military propaganda that she'd seen, with snippets of scripted events playing out of heavily armored individuals crossing through battlefields to deliver rations to troops, or an action shot of an armored individual jumping out of a window with a pretty female while under fire from a hail of lasers and plasma bolts. Throughout the video, she could make out quite a few different species being represented amongst the armored individuals, though one thing that stuck out was just how many humans were among them. This whole advert just felt overwhelmingly human, but maybe that was a good thing. She hadn't tried to reach out to any human mercenary groups, though that was likely due to the fact that they usually didn't have to operate this far from their territories and weren't always readily available to people like her. It was only after the advert had finished that she noticed that there was another notification waiting for her to pay attention to it. Clicking on it, she found that it was a direct message to her personal line, which was rather odd, but she pressed on as she looked over the writing that populated the holographic screen. Good morning, or perhaps good evening, Miss Lazuli Ferenc Haraz. My name is Persephone, an individual affiliated with the Bouquet Combat Couriers. It has come to my attention that you have been searching for someone to rescue your brother from space pirates. Is this still true? Space pirates? Do they mean the Void Raiders? Lazuli murmured to herself as she glanced at the panel with the still image of the advert for these Bouquet Combat Couriers before looking back to the message again. Ultimately, that was beside the point. What she had now was somebody who was actually reaching out to her about helping her brother. And it wasn't just anybody either. It was a group who apparently specialized in this sort of thing if the advert was anything to go by. After another moment to consider the events playing out before her, she decided to take the offer dangling before her and press forward as she sent her reply. What you have heard is true. Money is no object when it comes to getting back the only family I have left in this world. Almost a full second after she sent her reply, her Omni bracelet trilled with a response. The courier I represent is on the station as we speak. I have taken the liberty to upload a waypoint to the mapping program on your Omni bracelet. Follow it to locate the courier so that you may negotiate with them the terms of your brother's collection and delivery to you. Sure enough, a data packet was quickly installed onto her Omni bracelet without her permission as a holographic circular map began projecting itself along with a green trail that showed a path that she could take through the station. Lazuli couldn't help but just blink at what just happened. Second and triple guessing the supposed safety measures she was promised when she purchased this particular model of Omni bracelet. Or perhaps she should be more concerned with how little the Bouquet Combat Couriers cared for the sanctity of such security measures. Regardless, she now had a literal way forward for the first time since she began looking for help. Now that one presented itself to her, she would be a fool to ignore it. Quickly taking her leave from the cafe, she followed the holographic map through the Void Colony as she crossed through various districts, shopping centers, and neighborhoods until she finally reached the district where the courier was located almost 20 minutes later. Once she had gotten to be around 100 feet from the courier, the map was then suddenly replaced by a green arrow that pointed her in the direction she needed to go. Slowing her pace, she looked up from her Omni bracelet and studied her surroundings while slowly following the arrow. There were quite a few beings around her, even a number of humans who went around just going through their daily lives. It wasn't until she followed the arrow to her destination that she spotted someone who reminded her of the couriers she saw in the advert. Sitting there at some kind of drink kiosk was a helmeted individual wearing a thick jacket made of some tough-looking brown fabric. There were a few markings and sigils that decorated the individual's jacket, though one that caught her eye was a circle of thorny vines that surrounded a single rose. Beneath the circle was a cross followed by 3 lines, but those didn't make any sense to her. After having hesitated on her initial approach, Lazuli managed to steel herself and step forward before gently tapping on the individual's shoulder. "Excuse me, are you a courier with the Bouquet Combat Couriers?" The individual jolted at her touch with what she could only assume was surprise as they turned to look at her, though what she saw was merely a distorted reflection of her own face in their tinted visor. They didn't respond right away, but after a few seconds, a heavily modulated yet masculine-sounding voice spoke out. "Yes, I am affiliated with them. Is there something you need?" At the mere confirmation that this individual was the person who could help her save her brother, or at least affiliated with the group who could do that, her mood dramatically improved as she held out her hand in one of the more commonly accepted forms of greeting. "My name is Lazuli Ferenc Hroz. Your representative informed me that you would be willing to hear me out and negotiate the recovery of my little brother." The individual, the man perhaps, reached out and met her hand with a firm yet surprisingly gentle grip that radiated an inviting warmth. Her thoughts suddenly turned to her father, and how he always told her that you could learn a lot about a being from how good their handshake was, though that rarely ever translated well between different species. Yet at that moment, she remembered the advert she saw of the courier leaping from the window with the female held securely in their arms. As the man pulled away, she somehow knew that if her life was suddenly in danger in the next few seconds, this man's first action would be to protect her. "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Lazuli," the man replied with a surprising amount of politeness, though he tilted his head at her when he continued to speak, a vaguely confused tone managing to reach through to her despite his modulated voice. "But what do you mean by my representative? I don't have a—" "Oh, that's what happened," the man stated, as he seemingly had a revelation while slowly shaking his head. "Percy, what have I told you about taking on job requests without giving me a heads up first?" He spoke out in an admonishing sort of way. Lazuli couldn't help but look at least a little confused as she glanced over her shoulder before looking around, wondering just who this Percy was or where they were. However, her confusion was soon replaced by mild bewilderment as she watched a hologram of a small human female in odd-looking garb and a crown of thorny roses appear on the man's shoulder. "Oh, come now, Rosie. She wouldn't have found us otherwise, and she really needs our help," the small woman enthused with a smile on her little face as she pantomimed, tapping her knuckles against the reflective visor of the man. "I already screened most of the background info around this job, and it shouldn't be much trouble for you," she explained further before just sitting on his shoulder. The man just let out a modulated sigh before shrugging a bit. "I suppose if you put it that way, I don't really have much to argue against, now do I?" "Of course you can always argue, but it won't benefit you in any way this time," she mused with a mischievous-looking smile. The confusion must have been quite evident on Lazuli's face, as Percy smiled even more. "We've spoken before, at least through messages," she's mentioned cheerfully before gesturing at herself. "My full name is Persephone, but Rosie here calls me Percy for short," she explained as she acted out patting the side of the man's helmet. "Yeah, though I only call you Percy because a regal name like Persephone doesn't suit a scamp like you," he said, though, despite his words, Lazuli could make out a distinct tone of mirth, even with the modulation to his voice. This caused Percy to pout, though before she could reply, Lazuli managed to cut in as she regarded Percy and lowered her head in a show of gratitude. "Then it is thanks to you, Miss Persephone, that I have the opportunity to set things in motion that will see my brother home safe. Thank you so much," she expressed as sincerely as she could while doing her best to keep her composure, as she could feel all the stress of being unable to move forward finally start to melt away from her shoulders. Percy just flashed a little smile before shaking her head. "Oh, don't thank me. I was just being nosy is all," she said, while waving her hand in a dismissive way. "Now then, how about you fill in Rosie here with all the details so he can give you a proper quote?" At that, Lazuli nodded dutifully before looking to the man's visor and at her own reflection as she began sharing her files and everything she turned up on the possible void raiders that attacked her brother's vessel. Even though she couldn't see his face throughout the explanation, the man just nodded while reviewing the files for himself, and once Lazuli was done, his modulated voice spoke out. "All right, doesn't sound too difficult." Those words brought a smile to Lazuli's face as she couldn't help but feel even more relieved with each passing moment. "Great! So I take it that you just need to gather up your team and make your way over? Do you happen to have an idea how long it'll take you to be ready?" The man and Percy tilted their heads at her in unison before the man just shook his head at Lazuli's words. "Team? There's no team. It's just me. Myself and I. And Percy, of course. He explained while tilting his head again to gesture at the holographic woman on his shoulder. Lazuli's eyes just widened in shock at the revelation that the man intended on going on this rescue mission all alone when entire mercenary bands had turned her away. Well, what? Surely you're joking, right? It was then that Percy spoke up, wagging an admonishing finger at Lazuli. He's not joking, and don't call him Shirley, she said, holding a serious expression before flashing a smile. The man just sighed at Percy's comment before turning his expressionless face towards Lazuli again. Don't worry about it. I'm made of pretty sturdy stuff, and the hardware I deploy with is top of the line, he explained rather matter-of-factly. Lazuli just shook her head at that. I've heard the stories that humans are hardier and more durable than most, but only just barely so when compared to other races on your level. I'll gladly pay more if that is what it takes to send you with some support, she offered frantically. While she certainly was grateful to the human, she wasn't about to just let him run headlong towards his own death. Percy just laughed at Lazuli's expense, while the man held up his hands in a placating manner. I mean it. You don't have to worry. I'm quite literally built different when compared to most other humans, he explained before he started shrugging off his jacket and revealing to Lazuli that the entire length of his left arm, all the way up to his shoulder, was artificial. He then pulled off the glove that had been covering his left hand and reached down, tapping his metallic knuckles against both of his legs, which also rang out with the sounds of metal. See? I've got augments geared towards movement and combat, as well as a few other things I can't really show off here, he explained dutifully, his modulated voice sounding oddly reassuring as he pulled his glove and then jacket back on. Now, Lazuli wasn't squeamish, and she's been around people with cybernetics often enough with a prosthetic hand or arm being a general norm in day-to-day life. But she's never met a being with so many augmentations at once. She couldn't help but wonder if the man before her was more meat or machine, but at the very least, he seemed to be far more prepared for a fight than she ever could be. I see. The man nodded, seemingly in satisfaction as he settled back in his seat, turning his attention to a drink that he had been mostly neglecting since she arrived. It looked like some kind of extra thick vitamin shake. It was a grayish mixture with a slight green tint that had a straw that was more than wide enough for how thick the mixture looked. Lazuli watched on with interest, wondering if she was going to see what the man looked like, only to feel a sense of confusion as she watched a small port open around where she would assume his chin would be. The straw seemingly was slotted into something as the man took a big sip before setting the drink back down. Now then, let's talk about service packages. Based on everything you've told me so far, I'm thinking you're going to want the Guardian Angel package for rescue, protection, care, and transport of your brother. Now there are other, he went on to explain as he held up his left arm when a holographic screen with a listing of prices and descriptions of services began scrolling out before Lazuli. But before he could go any further, Lazuli piped up looking rather apologetic. I'm sorry, but before we go any further, could you perhaps tell me your name? She had heard Percy refer to him as Rosie, but she didn't want to be rude and offend the man. And now that he was getting ready to risk his life for her family, she felt it was only right to make sure she knew what to call him. The man before her hesitated for a moment before setting his arm down and sitting up a little straighter. My ID is Rose 13, but you may refer to me as R13. Lazuli couldn't help but be taken aback at his introduction. It was hardly a name at all, and he only wanted to be referred to by a mere letter and 2 numbers? Oh, very well then. R13. Thank you again for everything you're about to do. Rose 13 just watched her for a moment before offering a slow nod. It's just my job. Your payment will be thanks enough, he said simply before holding his arm up again. Speaking of which, he mentioned before holding it out for her again. At that, Lazuli just smiled softly before bobbing her head in response. Of course, what were the packages again? A woman with white hair, red eyes, and pale skin. We're sitting on a rooftop I don't recognize, under a blue sky that feels so alien yet familiar to me. It's such a peaceful and intimate moment. I flip through to the next page of a book with words that are nothing but blurry scribbles. After all, the book isn't what's important here. It's the woman. She says something with that lovely smile on her face, yet the words don't reach my ears as she scoots a little closer and leans her head on my left shoulder. I'm filled with such an indescribable warmth, a sense of longing and need that makes my heart ache in a way I just can't put into words. I reach out with my right hand to gently cradle her cheek because I'm about to surprise her with a kiss. But just before I make contact, an alert trilled in my head as the uplink to my ship so rudely notifies me with an update. I open my eyes to see the familiar ceiling of my ship quarters as panels of updates and notifications unobtrusively fill my periphery. With a glance, I see my right hand absently clutching at my left shoulder socket, my remaining human limb absently feeling the cold metallic alloy that long replaced what used to be me as I sigh to nobody in particular. "Did you have the rabbit lady dream again?" Percy asked, her holographic figure sitting at my desk with my private terminal as she slowly kicked and swayed her legs off the edge of my desk. "Rabbit girl?" I parroted back. I knew what she was talking about, but I wasn't quite ready to talk about it as I released my shoulder before reaching down to my waist and disconnecting the thick cable that uploaded my system's diagnostics to the ship computers and kept my energy cells topped off. Once I was unplugged from the ship, the cable began sliding back into the port I pulled it from while I started going through the motions of pushing myself up and balancing myself on my metallic leg stumps. "You know the one. You've told me about her," Percy mentioned with a small smile on her little face. She made a show of waving her hand, opening the compartment that stored my limbs as I reached out and grabbed my left arm before bringing it over to my exposed shoulder socket and hooking it back into place. "The woman with the white hair, red eyes, and pale skin. Your description of her reminds me a lot of those albino rabbits from Earth, hence, the rabbit girl. She explains to me all over again. What makes you think I was dreaming about her?" I deflect for a little while longer as my body jolts with the rush of information, my system syncing up with my arm while the readouts for the arm scroll down the left-hand side of my vision as I flex my artificial limb, opening and closing my left hand before taking up my right leg and hooking that one up next. "Well, your brainwaves showed that you were having a happy dream, and they matched the usual patterns during other times where you've mentioned having that dream. The same areas tend to light up in similar ways, and then when you wake up, you tend to be rather sad." She explained her usual cheer was rather subdued as she watched me jolt again as the diagnostics for my right leg started scrolling down my field of view. I just sigh a little more as I collect my left leg from the wall panel and go through the motions of hooking that one up while flexing the mechanical toes of my right leg. "Haven't I asked you to not watch me while I sleep? I'm sure there are plenty of other things that could demand your attention on our ship," I said almost rhetorically. "We've had this conversation quite a few times before, but it's not like I care whether or not she watches me. I know it's one of the many ways she shows that she cares for and looks out for me, so I'm not about to put up more than a token defense concerning the violation of my mental privacy." At that, Percy just smiled as she stood on my desk and played at walking along the edge of it. "Well, if I didn't know how you were feeling, how would I know whether or not to start with the good news or bad news first?" She mused while pretending to nearly lose her balance, complete with the sudden arm flailing before righting herself and stepping away from the edge of my desk with a playful smile on her little face. I couldn't help but muster a little smile as I watched her, but it was soon replaced by a grimace as my body involuntarily jolted one more time as the diagnostics rolled down my periphery. "All right, well then, go ahead. Give me the news," I offered, flexing my mechanical toes before pushing off my bed and tapping at a panel in my room which began pulling my bed into the wall, giving me more room to move around as I started my stretches to make sure everything was in order. "Good news first," Percy chirped as she mimicked my movements, her projection pantomiming my stretches as I balanced on my left foot, brought my right knee up to my chest, and held that pose. "We found the trace of our package's vessel and tracked it to its last known location." "So what's the bad news?" I asked, as I brought my right leg down and began to balance on it while bringing my left knee up to my chest. It was just the black box, but in other news, there were no signs of a battle in local space, so at the very least, the black box was likely deliberately removed and ejected into the void. She explained while rolling her shoulders in the same way I was before shadowboxing like me. "So, from the sounds of it, the pirates likely took the whole ship with them. So we aren't looking for a frozen corpse floating around in space, right? Did you already bring in the black box?" I asked, as I threw in alternating high kicks before winding down and reviewing the readouts for my limbs on my HUD and nodding with satisfaction at the results. "Well, of course, Rosie. I had a maintenance drone scoop it up and brought it into the cargo bay. I also took the liberty of mining the data from its records and triangulated the possible destination the pirates were headed for after taking into account the surrounding star systems based on the nearest jump points in this area." Percy explained eagerly as the door to my quarters slid open the moment I took a step towards them. "So we have a heading then? That's good to hear," I said as I made my way down the central hall of my ship to the kitchenette, which was also the common room that separated the cockpit from the rest of my ship. Looking around, I spotted a still steaming fresh cup of coffee from the drink dispenser. Yep, I've also gone ahead and set our flight plan to the nearest star systems, which don't have properly settled colonies or void stations. Essentially, we're going to be checking out wild space and see if we can't track down our pirates from there. Percy explained as her hologram appeared on the counter next to the dispenser and smiled up at me. Given all these developments, I figured I should wake you so you can start preparing your loadout, just in case we find them sooner rather than later. Sounds good to me, Percy. Excellent work, I say while offering her small form a smile. Taking up the cup from the dispenser, I take a sip of the hot but not scalding liquid, savoring the brew which had been flavored with hazelnut syrup before heading back down the hall toward the armory. We restocked components for the printer, right? I asked, not entirely sure of the stock right this moment as I took another sip of coffee. Of course, Rosie, I made sure to handle that as I found that job with Miss Lazuli. We can't have you being unprepared now, can we? She mused from the ship speakers as the doors to the armory opened. Inside, I spotted the 2 sets of armor that I was currently maintaining. The one on the right was the Infiltrator series, specially designed with light armor for stealth and getting into and out of places without leaving much of a trace. The second set I maintained was the Sentinel series with mid-grade armor, which could survive against sustained fire of kinetic weapons, as well as shielding graded against laser and plasma fire. This one was geared towards combat in closed spaces with a focus on mobility rather than hunkering down and trying to tank sustained fire in a corridor. Most of my equipment was modular, and the loadouts provided to me by the BCC tended to cover a wide variety of possible scenarios, though whole new sets of armor were costly to print and put together. So when are you going to finally splurge for the Juggernaut series? Percy muses as her holographic image appears on the shoulders of the Infiltrator armor set. Her small figure looking rather cozy as she lays on her side in a very relaxed manner while I make my way over to the weapons workbench to look over what I'll bring with me. I'm not going to, because I don't plan on ever putting myself in a situation that would demand such heavy armor. I mused almost dismissively as I grabbed a telescopic baton, flicking it open in my right hand and looking it over before closing it back up by pressing the end against my left palm. And because I'm not a battle junkie that enjoys running through war zones like Sakura 17 and Wafflers 28, I said with a small smirk as I set the baton down in a bin before taking up a compact laser pistol and disassembling the modular sidearm to check over the parts and see if anything needed replacing. I don't care if you're a battle junkie or not, I just think it would be neat if you started keeping a set around. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, she quoted to me as she disappeared from the shoulder of the Infiltrator armor and reappeared in front of me as she walked along the workbench and stepped over the grip of the laser pistol before sitting down on a low-powered motorized screwdriver. Are you still thinking about that mining outpost? I asked, as I recalled the job from around 3 months ago. I had been tasked with delivering some shutdown codes to a mining facility on an ice planet that had been taken over by some rebels in the middle of some civil war of some kind. I didn't know the specifics, and it wasn't my job to know. The plan had gone mostly without a hitch, and I had shut down the main reactor which was keeping the facilities running, though it was on my way out that I had been spotted by the rebels, and they wheeled out a mining laser. They retrofitted into a mobile laser cannon and started blasting at me with what power was still stored in the battery that was mounted to it. Between the rebels and their own weapons and the laser cannon itself, I ended up getting pinned and needed Percy to bring the ship in for a danger-close extraction that cost me my left arm. Of course, it was just my prosthetic, but it was a pretty close call that could have ended up with me losing my life if I had made any more mistakes that day. Ever since then, Percy would occasionally suggest I look into getting the Juggernaut series of armor since that set was graded for heavy arms and energy weapons, on par with a mining laser. While I can appreciate the sentiment, I feel that it's just a knee-jerk reaction on Percy's part, and that sort of costly expense isn't necessary for the sorts of jobs I usually sign on for. As I began checking the laser pistol's energy pack for its current charge, I watched Percy just pout at my words before twiddling her holographic fingers together. Well, excuse me for still being concerned, Rosie, she replied indignantly before crossing her little arms together. I'm the one who was getting live updates on your vitals throughout that whole encounter. I know just how close to death you were and just how much pain you were in. So forgive me for wanting to avoid something like that from happening again, she said while sounding almost frantic as her image flickered for a second. I just offered her a sigh and took up my cup of coffee, taking another sip of the brown liquid before setting it back down and looking her over. I really do appreciate your concern, Percy, but that armor is just impractical for me to maintain. I'm going to have close calls. That's just the risk we run doing the work we do. But I know with you watching my back, no matter how much damage I might sustain, you'll make sure I make it out alive and mostly intact. I explained simply as I went about putting the laser pistol back together. Percy still pouted a little while longer before tilting her head side to side and letting out a little sigh. Fine, Rosie. If you put it that way, I suppose I shouldn't keep worrying as much as I have been. Her image flickered as she now stood, walking away from the motorized screwdriver as she wandered around the modular compact laser pistol while I snapped everything back into place. Though if you're going to try and get me to relax on the Juggernaut Armor series, then you're going to have to let me make some modifications to the Sentinel series, deal? She said as she held out her hand as if to shake on it. I couldn't help but quirk a brow at her and offer her a vague smile as the edges of my lips twitched up for a moment. What sort of modifications are you planning? Percy just grinned playfully before bringing a finger to her lips. It's going to be a surprise, just trust me, okay? She mused before holding her hand out to me again. After a moment, I simply shrugged before reaching out my index finger and placing it in her palm, shaking her hand in agreement. I suppose I could live with that, I said in response. Though as soon as we shook hands, the Sentinel series armor set was pulled into the wall as the faint sounds of mechanical whirring and drilling pricked my ears. Percy just smiled a little more before her image flickered for a moment. I just got a hit on the package's vessel. She enthused excitedly as the door to the armory opened. You're going to want to take a look at this. Sure, okay, I say as I stand, setting the mostly reassembled laser pistol down on the workbench before getting to my feet and making my way back down the hall again. The doors to the cockpit open at my approach, my chair rising up from the floor as I settled in, and began remotely syncing my HUD to my ship as the interface started popping out with me with all kinds of relevant data. Once everything settled, I looked out through the void shield and spotted a vessel in the reflective glow of a gas giant. So what am I looking at? I asked Percy, letting her take the reins. You're looking at some no-good pirates, that's what. She mused almost playfully, choosing to remain out of view for now as the void shield's HUD began to zoom and focus on the vessel. Looks like they're scrappers too. That's why we didn't see signs of a proper battle. She speculated as the image focused in and showed the package's vessel beneath the pirate's vessel. Only it looks like barely half of it was still intact. What are you thinking? Close-range EMP to knock out the ship's systems and take the whole ship, crew and all? That would require some rather specialized and powerful equipment, but a scrapper vessel that big would likely have the power source to do it. Something like that, Rosie. Percy answered in agreement as the image zoomed out to look over the ship in question. That whole vessel is just a big old floating chop shop. It's an inspired operation for sure, she mentioned thoughtfully before finally coming into view as she appeared on the ship's console. I'll start plotting a good entry point. They don't know we're here yet, so take your time and get geared up, got it? She enthused reassuringly with a confident thumbs up. Got it, is all I say in response before getting up and making my back down to the armory all over again.